The winter of 1944 brought more than just freezing temperatures to the soldiers fighting across Europe. It brought a revelation that would save thousands of lives. A simple change in how men dug into the earth during combat would transform survival rates against one of warfare's most devastating weapons, artillery fire. This is the story of how American fighting men learned, through blood and experience, that the way they'd been taught to dig foxholes was getting them hurt or worse, and how a handful of observations from the front lines revolutionized infantry tactics forever. December 1944, the Ardennes Forest in Belgium and Luxembourg. The temperature had plummeted below freezing, and snow blanketed the dense woodland in an eerie white silence. American troops, stretched thin along an 80-mile front, huddled in their positions, believing this quiet sector was a place to rest and regroup after months of brutal combat. Private First Class Robert Jenkins from Iowa crouched in his foxhole, a shallow depression he'd scraped into the frozen ground with his entrenching tool. The hole was barely 2 feet deep, just enough to get his body below ground level when he laid flat. This was exactly how he'd been trained at Fort Benning. Quick to dig, easy to abandon if needed, and providing just enough cover from small arms fire. Jenkins had no way of knowing that in less than 48 hours, his world would explode in the largest battle the United States Army would fight in World War II. The Battle of the Bulge was about to begin, and the lessons learned in its opening salvos would echo through military doctrine for generations to come. At 0500 hours on December 16th, the German artillery opened up. The sound was unlike anything most American soldiers had experienced, hundreds of guns firing in coordinated waves. The earth itself seemed to convulse under the bombardment, trees splintered into deadly projectiles. The air filled with razor-sharp metal fragments traveling at supersonic speeds. Private Jenkins pressed himself flat against the bottom of his shallow foxhole, his body trembling not just from cold, but from the primal terror of being caught in an artillery barrage. Each explosion sent shock waves through the frozen ground, hammering his chest and lungs. The overpressure from nearby detonations felt like being punched by an invisible giant. And then came the realization that would be repeated in thousands of foxholes across that front. The shallow depressions they'd been taught to dig offered almost no protection from artillery. When a shell exploded above or near a shallow foxhole, the blast effect and fragments traveled downward and outward. A soldier lying flat in a 2-foot-deep hole was still well within the lethal radius of even a medium-caliber shell landing nearby. The casualties mounted quickly. Medical aid stations were overwhelmed within the first hours of the German offensive. Combat medics moving between positions found wounded men in their foxholes, victims not of direct hits, which were relatively rare, but of the blast effects and shrapnel from near misses. Staff Sergeant Michael O'Brien, a squad leader from the 2nd Infantry Division, survived that first barrage by sheer luck. His position happened to be in a natural depression that was deeper than standard. As he moved between his men's positions after the shelling stopped, checking for casualties and reorganizing his squad, he noticed something that would save lives in the weeks to come. The men who had dug deeper, even just a foot or two more than regulation, had fared significantly better. Those who had found natural depressions or had taken extra time to dig down further showed fewer injuries from the same barrage that had devastated nearby positions with shallower holes. O'Brien wasn't a trained engineer or a tactics instructor. He was a farm boy from Nebraska who'd worked construction before the war, but he understood something fundamental about blast effects that the training manuals hadn't emphasized enough. Depth mattered. More depth meant exponentially better protection. As the Battle of the Bulge raged on through that bitter December, sergeants and officers across the front began sharing observations. Units that had the time and energy to dig deeper foxholes showed better survival rates during artillery attacks. The evidence was mounting. written in the grim arithmetic of casualties and survivors. But there was more to it than just depth. The shape of the foxhole mattered too. The standard training called for a roughly circular or rectangular depression, simple to dig but not optimal for protection. Some soldiers, either through instinct or prior experience, had begun modifying the design. Corporal James Washington, an engineer attached to an infantry company, started teaching his fellow soldiers a different approach. Instead of just digging straight down, he showed them how to create an L-shaped foxhole. The vertical part provided the depth needed for protection, while a horizontal section at the bottom created a small space where a soldier could shelter during bombardment. The concept wasn't entirely new. Experienced soldiers from the North Africa and Italian campaigns had developed similar techniques. But in the chaos of rapid advances across France in the summer and fall of 1944, much of that hard-won knowledge hadn't been systematically passed down to newer replacements. Washington's modification worked because it addressed how artillery actually hurts people. When a shell explodes, it creates three main threats. First, the fragments of the shell casing itself, which spread outward in a roughly spherical pattern. Second, debris from whatever the shell hits, rocks, wood, metal, which becomes secondary projectiles. Third, and often most devastating, the blast over pressure, an invisible wave of compressed air that can cause terrible internal injuries even without visible wounds. A shallow, straight-down foxhole left a soldier exposed to all three threats, especially the fragments and secondary projectiles that traveled on shallow trajectories. But an L-shaped hole with proper depth meant that most fragments would pass overhead, and the soldier could crouch in the protected horizontal section, shielded from everything but a direct hit. The problem was time and energy. Digging a proper deep foxhole in frozen ground was exhausting work. It could take hours, and in combat conditions, hours were a luxury few units possessed. Soldiers arriving at a new position often faced a brutal choice: dig shallow and fast, or dig deep, and risk being caught partially finished when the enemy attacked. Captain David Morrison, a company commander in the 28th Infantry Division, found himself grappling with this dilemma repeatedly as his unit fought through the Ardennes. His men were exhausted, moving from position to position every few days as the fluid battle situation evolved. Each time they stopped, he had to decide whether to order deep foxholes, knowing his men might not finish before they had to move again or before the enemy found them. Morrison was a graduate of West Point, trained in the classical tactics of warfare. But the reality of modern artillery was forcing him to reconsider everything he'd learned. He'd read the after-action reports coming from other units. The data was clear. Casualties from artillery were lower in units that prioritized proper foxhole construction, even if it meant arriving at positions earlier and spending more time digging. He made a decision that would ripple through his company and eventually influence doctrine throughout the Army. He instituted a mandatory digging policy. Whenever his unit stopped for more than 2 hours, every man would dig a proper foxhole at least 4 feet deep with an L-shaped or T-shaped configuration, if time permitted. No exceptions, regardless of how tired the men were. The initial reaction was predictable. Already exhausted soldiers, many of them teenagers far from home, faced with frozen ground and primitive entrenching tools, grumbled and complained. Some questioned the order openly. After all, they'd been fighting for months with shallow foxholes. Why change now? Morrison gathered his platoon leaders and squad leaders and showed them the casualty reports. He walked them through the mathematics of survival. A company that took 2 hours to dig proper positions but suffered 20% fewer casualties in the next artillery barrage had more effective combat power than a company that dug shallow holes quickly. The lesson took hold slowly at first, then spread rapidly as the evidence became undeniable. After the next major German artillery strike, Morrison's company suffered significantly fewer casualties than adjacent units that hadn't adopted the deeper digging policy. Word spread through the regiment, then the division, but the evolution of foxhole tactics didn't stop with just digging deeper. Experienced soldiers began developing additional innovations based on the specific conditions they faced. In rocky ground where deep digging was nearly impossible, men learned to build up protective walls using rocks and logs, creating what were essentially above-ground bunkers. In areas with high water tables where holes quickly filled with freezing water, soldiers developed elevated platforms with sandbagged walls. Lieutenant Colonel Arthur Hayes, a battalion operations officer, started documenting these field innovations and distributing them as informal tactical bulletins. His mimeographed sheets, passed from unit to unit, became an unofficial supplement to the official training manuals. They included diagrams, measurements, and most importantly, the reasoning behind each design choice. Hayes understood something that would later become a cornerstone of military training philosophy. Soldiers needed to understand not just what to do, but why they were doing it. When men understood that a 4-foot-deep foxhole reduced their chance of becoming a casualty by 60% compared to a 2-foot hole, they found the motivation to dig that extra 2 feet, even through frozen ground at midnight after a day of combat. The science behind the protection offered by depth was actually quite straightforward, though it wasn't common knowledge among infantry soldiers at the time. Artillery shells, whether high explosive or the dreaded airbursts, created casualty zones that could be mathematically calculated. The zones were three-dimensional, but they weren't spherical. They were more like elongated bubbles, with most of the lethal fragments traveling outward and slightly downward from the point of detonation. A shell exploding at ground level created a casualty zone that extended outward in a rough circle, but with a much more limited depth below ground. Each foot of depth below the surface reduced the fragment density exponentially. At 2 feet deep, a soldier was still within the primary casualty zone of a near miss. At 4 feet deep, most fragments would pass overhead. At 6 feet, only a very close explosion or a direct hit posed a serious threat from fragmentation. Of course, reaching 6 feet of depth was often impractical in combat conditions. Engineers calculated that 4 to 5 feet represented the optimal balance between protection and the time and energy required for construction. This became the new informal standard that spread through combat units. The winter conditions of the Ardennes added another dimension to the foxhole equation. The frozen ground made digging exponentially harder, but it also meant that properly constructed positions held their shape better and didn't fill with mud. Soldiers developed techniques for dealing with frozen earth. Some units managed to scrounge thermite grenades, originally designed as anti-tank weapons, to thaw the ground before digging. Others built fires in the spot where they planned to dig, letting them burn for an hour to soften the earth. Private Thomas Kowalski from Detroit, a machine gunner, became something of a legend in his company for his foxhole construction speed. Before the war, he'd worked as a grave digger at a cemetery, a job that gave him both the strength and the technique for efficient excavation. Kowalski could dig a 4-foot-deep, properly shaped foxhole in frozen ground in under 2 hours, half the time it took most soldiers. His secret, which he shared freely with anyone who asked, was to work smarter rather than harder. Instead of trying to chop straight down through frozen earth, he would first outline the foxhole's shape and then work around the perimeter, cutting down at an angle. This created a wedge that could be pried out rather than having to chip away at resistant frozen soil. Once he'd gone down a foot or so, the earth below was usually softer, protected from the deepest frost by the upper layer. Kowalski's technique spread through word of mouth, another example of how practical field knowledge moved through the Army informally, soldier to soldier, often faster than official training updates could be disseminated through the formal chain of command. The psychological impact of proper foxholes was as important as the physical protection they provided. Soldiers who felt safer in their positions fought more effectively. They could focus on their tactical mission rather than being paralyzed by fear during bombardments. Officers noticed that units with good defensive positions showed better discipline and morale. There was a particular incident in early January 1945 that crystallized the importance of these lessons for many soldiers. A German counterattack was preceded by a massive artillery preparation, one of the heaviest concentrations of fire the Americans had faced in the European theater. One regiment, which had spent 2 days preparing defensive positions with deep, well-constructed foxholes, survived the barrage with minimal casualties. An adjacent regiment, which had arrived at their positions just hours before and had only shallow, hasty positions, suffered devastating losses from the same bombardment. The contrast was stark enough that even the highest levels of command took notice. General Omar Bradley, commanding the 12th Army Group, ordered a comprehensive review of infantry defensive techniques. The resulting report, compiled in February 1945, officially changed the Army's doctrine on foxhole construction. The new guidance specified minimum depths, recommended configurations, and emphasized that time spent on proper defensive preparation was never wasted, even in fluid offensive operations. The report noted that units that regularly constructed proper fighting positions showed not only lower casualty rates, but also higher offensive effectiveness when they did attack, because they maintained more of their veteran combat soldiers. But doctrine changes at headquarters didn't automatically translate to changes in the field. The real transformation happened soldier by soldier, squad by squad. It happened when a sergeant told his men the story of the unit that survived because they dug deep. It happened when a veteran showed a replacement how to construct an L-shaped hole and explained why the design mattered. Corporal William Anderson, a rifleman who'd survived from D-Day through the winter campaign, put it simply in a letter home to his family in Oregon. He wrote, "We learned that the ground is your best friend in a fight, not just laying on it, but getting into it. Every inch deeper you can dig is another chance to come home." The lessons learned in the frozen Ardennes foxholes spread throughout the theater. Units in Italy, where the terrain was different but the artillery threat remained constant, adapted the techniques to their conditions. In the final drive into Germany, American infantry showed a marked improvement in their defensive preparations. German officers, when interviewed after the war, noted the change. One regimental commander observed that American positions in the final months of the war were significantly more robust than those encountered earlier. He attributed some of the German army's declining effectiveness to their inability to achieve the same casualty ratios with artillery fire that they had earlier in the war. The spring offensive of 1945 saw American armies driving deep into Germany. The war was clearly entering its final phase, but the fighting remained intense. German forces, though depleted and poorly supplied, often fought with desperate determination. Artillery duels remained a constant feature of the front lines. Technical Sergeant Raymond Foster, now a platoon sergeant after surviving the entire winter campaign, had become evangelical about proper foxhole construction. He carried Lieutenant Colonel Hayes's tactical bulletins in his pack, dog-eared and stained, and referred to them constantly when his platoon established new positions. Foster had developed his own additions to the standard techniques. He taught his men to dig drainage sumps at the lowest point of their foxholes, small pits that collected water and prevented the main fighting position from flooding. He showed them how to create overhead cover using logs, dirt, and whatever materials were available. Protection not just from fragments but from tree bursts, a particularly deadly form of artillery fire where shells were fused to explode in the treetops, showering down fragments and splintered wood. His men trusted him because they'd seen the results. In a campaign where infantry companies could lose a third of their strength in a week of heavy fighting, Foster's platoon maintained relatively low casualties. It wasn't luck. It was technique and discipline. The March crossing of the Rhine River presented new challenges for foxhole construction. The flat, open plains beyond the river offered little natural cover. The water table was high, making deep excavation difficult. But by this point, the lessons had been so thoroughly internalized that soldiers automatically adapted. Where digging was impossible, they built up. Sandbag walls, initially just knee-high, were improved and heightened whenever units stayed in position for more than a few hours. Soldiers scrounged materials from destroyed buildings, using rubble, timber, and even furniture to reinforce positions. What had started as a realization about foxhole depth had evolved into a broader understanding of defensive engineering. Private First Class Johnny Martinez from Texas, an assistant squad leader, found himself teaching these techniques to German prisoners who were being employed in construction work behind the lines. The irony wasn't lost on him. The German army had started the war with superior doctrine in many areas, including defensive engineering. But years of fighting on the Eastern Front had depleted their experienced veterans, and the replacements filling their ranks were often poorly trained teenagers or older men pulled from reserve status. Martinez, who'd barely graduated high school before being drafted, now possessed practical knowledge that exceeded what many German soldiers had learned. War was a brutal teacher, but for those who survived, the lessons were thorough. As April arrived and the Allied armies drove deeper into the crumbling Reich, the character of the fighting began to change. German resistance became more sporadic, alternating between fanatical defense of certain positions and rapid collapse in others. American units began to encounter concentration camps, confronting the full horror of what the Nazi regime had perpetrated. The mood darkened and the urgency to end the war intensified. But even as victory came into sight, the mundane realities of survival remained. Soldiers still dug foxholes each night, artillery still fell, men still lived or perished, based on decisions made in moments of exhaustion about whether to dig another 6 inches deeper into the earth. Staff Sergeant O'Brien, who'd made those crucial early observations during the Battle of the Bulge, found himself training a fresh batch of replacements in late April. These young men had missed the worst of the fighting, arriving as the German military machine finally collapsed. But O'Brien taught them anyway, showing them how to dig, explaining why depth mattered, demonstrating the L-shaped configuration. One of the replacements asked him if it really mattered now, with the war obviously ending. O'Brien's response was blunt. Every man I've seen fall because of artillery was probably thinking it wouldn't matter, that the next shell would miss, that he'd be fine. Digging properly isn't about probabilities. It's about doing everything in your power to make sure you're one of the ones who makes it home. The formal German surrender came on May 8, 1945. Victory in Europe Day brought celebrations across the Allied world. In the combat zones, soldiers' reactions were more muted. Relief, certainly. Exhaustion. And for many, a kind of numbness, born from months or years of constant tension. As the armies of occupation settled into their new roles, the combat veterans began the process of going home. But the knowledge they'd gained, purchased with blood and terror, didn't leave with them. The lessons were incorporated into official doctrine, written into training manuals, taught to the next generation of soldiers at Fort Benning and 100 other training bases across America. The specific innovation of deeper, better-designed foxholes became part of a broader evolution in infantry tactics. The American military, which had entered the war with doctrine that was in many ways outdated, emerged with a sophisticated understanding of modern combat that would influence military thinking for decades. Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery, the British commander who'd worked closely with American forces throughout the campaign, observed after the war that one of the American Army's greatest strengths had been its ability to learn and adapt. He specifically cited the evolution of defensive techniques as an example of how American pragmatism and willingness to modify doctrine based on combat experience had contributed to Allied victory. The statistical analysis done after the war confirmed what soldiers in the field had already learned through experience. Units that had adopted the deeper foxhole techniques and other defensive improvements showed casualty rates from artillery that were 40 to 60% lower than comparable units using earlier techniques. Given that artillery and mortar fire accounted for approximately 70% of all combat casualties in the European theater, these improved defensive techniques likely saved many thousands of lives. But numbers, however significant, don't capture the human reality. Each casualty prevented was a specific person, a husband who came home to his wife, a son who returned to his parents, a young man who got to live a full life, to have children and grandchildren, to grow old. The ripple effects of those saved lives touched countless other lives in ways that can never be fully calculated. Private First Class Robert Jenkins, who'd endured that first terrible artillery barrage in the Ardennes in a shallow foxhole, made it home to Iowa in July 1945. He brought with him an entrenching tool that had dug more foxholes than he could count. He kept it in his garage for the rest of his life, a reminder of lessons learned the hard way. He rarely spoke about the war like many veterans of his generation, but on one occasion, speaking to his grandson, who was heading to Army basic training in the early 1970s, he offered one piece of advice. Whatever they teach you about digging in, about protecting yourself, pay attention. Those lessons were bought by men who didn't get the chance to learn them. You owe it to them to remember. The Korean War, which began just 5 years after World War II ended, saw the doctrine that had been refined in the European theater put to use in a completely different environment. The hills and mountains of Korea presented new challenges, but the fundamental principles remained sound. Depth provided protection. Proper design saved lives. Time spent on defensive preparation was never wasted. Young officers and sergeants who'd learned their craft in the final years of World War II became the senior leaders of the Korean War. They brought with them the accumulated wisdom of combat experience, including those hard-won lessons about foxhole construction. The cycle continued, knowledge passing from one generation of soldiers to the next. The Vietnam War presented yet another environment with its own unique challenges. The jungle terrain of Southeast Asia made traditional foxhole construction difficult or impossible in many situations. But the underlying principle that proper defensive positions saved lives remained valid. Soldiers adapted the techniques to their circumstances, building bunkers, reinforcing positions with logs and sandbags, always seeking that optimal balance between protection and practicality. Modern military doctrine still emphasizes the importance of defensive positions. The technology has changed dramatically. Today's soldiers have access to prefabricated fighting positions, radar systems that can track incoming artillery shells, and sophisticated protective equipment. But when artillery falls, the safest place to be is still deep in the ground, in a properly constructed fighting position. The entrenching tool carried by soldiers today is descended directly from the implements used in World War II. The design has been refined, the materials improved, but the basic function remains the same. It's a tangible link to those frozen nights in the Ardennes, to the exhausted men chipping through frozen earth, to the hard lessons learned in combat. Military historians studying the evolution of infantry tactics often identify the World War II period as a crucial time of transformation. The combination of industrialized warfare, mass mobilization, and rapid technological change forced militaries to adapt in ways they never had before. The American military, despite its late entry into the war and initial deficiencies in many areas, proved remarkably capable of learning and improving. The story of foxhole evolution is just one example of this adaptive process, but it's an important one. It shows how battlefield experience, when properly analyzed and disseminated, could lead to concrete improvements in survival and effectiveness. It demonstrates the vital role of non-commissioned officers and junior leaders in identifying problems and developing solutions. And it illustrates how informal networks of knowledge sharing among soldiers could sometimes be more effective than formal training systems. There were no medals awarded for digging good foxholes, no battle honors bestowed for proper defensive preparation. The men who developed and spread these techniques did so not for recognition, but because they wanted to survive, and they wanted their friends and comrades to survive. That simple, powerful motivation drove innovation and saved lives. Some military analysts have calculated that improved defensive techniques, including but not limited to better foxhole construction, may have shortened the war in Europe by weeks or even months. By allowing American units to maintain combat effectiveness despite heavy artillery bombardments, these techniques enabled more sustained offensive operations. Units that would have been decimated by German artillery instead survived to continue attacking, maintaining pressure that the German military couldn't withstand. This raises a profound question about the nature of military innovation. Sometimes the most important advances aren't new weapons or dramatic tactical maneuvers. Sometimes they're simple improvements in basic techniques that allow soldiers to survive and keep fighting. The unglamorous work of digging a proper foxhole, done thousands of times by hundreds of thousands of soldiers, cumulatively had a strategic impact that rivaled more celebrated innovations. The psychological dimension shouldn't be underestimated either. Soldiers who felt protected could fight more effectively. Fear is a constant companion in combat, but it can be managed. A soldier in a deep, well-constructed foxhole during an artillery barrage was still terrified, but he had something to focus on besides his fear. He could believe that his preparation would save him. That belief, whether or not it was entirely rational, made him more capable when the barrage ended and the infantry assault began. Leaders who understood this psychology could get more from their men. Captain Morrison's insistence on proper defensive preparation wasn't just about physical protection. It was about maintaining morale and combat effectiveness. His men might have grumbled about the extra work, but they also knew their captain was trying to keep them alive. That knowledge built trust, and trust was the foundation of effective military units. The relationship between technology and tactics is complex and often misunderstood. New weapons drive tactical changes, certainly, but tactics also evolve independently based on experience and analysis. The artillery that American soldiers faced in World War II wasn't fundamentally different from the artillery of World War I. What changed was how soldiers protected themselves against it. This change was possible because the American military, despite its size and bureaucracy, maintained enough flexibility to incorporate lessons from the field. The fact that techniques developed by sergeants and privates could, within months, become official doctrine and be taught at training schools shows an organizational culture that valued effectiveness over rigid adherence to existing procedures. Not every army in World War II showed this flexibility. Some militaries remained wedded to tactics that had been proven ineffective, unable or unwilling to adapt. The German military, which had pioneered combined arms warfare and showed great tactical innovation in the war's early years, became increasingly rigid as the war progressed. By 1945, they were often fighting with tactics that had been superseded by Allied innovations. The Soviet military showed great adaptability in some areas, particularly in armored warfare and artillery tactics, but less so in infantry techniques. Soviet infantry often fought with brutal effectiveness, but accepted casualty rates that Western armies would have found unacceptable. The focus was on mass and momentum rather than on protecting individual soldiers. The British military, with its longer institutional memory and extensive combat experience, had many effective techniques, but sometimes struggled to share knowledge across units. The British Army was less homogeneous than the American, with distinct regimental traditions and training systems. This created pockets of excellence, but also meant that innovations didn't always spread as quickly as they might have. The American approach, shaped by the nation's democratic culture and relative lack of rigid military tradition, proved effective in the context of World War II. The Army that emerged victorious was, in many ways, a learning organization that had evolved dramatically from the force that had landed in North Africa in late 1942. As the decades passed and World War II receded from living memory into history, the specific details of foxhole construction became less immediate, but the broader lesson remained relevant. Organizations that learn from experience, that empower their people at every level to identify problems and develop solutions, that maintain flexibility in the face of changing circumstances, those organizations are more likely to succeed when tested. The veterans who came home from Europe carried these lessons with them into civilian life. Many became teachers, managers, community leaders. The habits of mind they developed, the understanding that preparation mattered, that details could be the difference between success and failure, influenced how they approached challenges in peacetime. There's a memorial at the National Infantry Museum at Fort Benning, Georgia. It's a simple display showing the evolution of the foxhole from World War I through the present. Life-size dioramas show soldiers in different eras in their fighting positions, with explanatory text describing the tactical thinking behind each design. Visitors, most of whom have never experienced combat, walk past quickly. It's not as dramatic as displays of weapons or battle dioramas, but for those who understand what it represents, it's perhaps the most important exhibit in the museum. It shows how armies learn, how soldiers survive, and how small improvements in basic techniques can have profound impacts. Every soldier who dug a proper foxhole and survived an artillery barrage owed a debt to those who'd learned the lessons before them, and they paid that debt forward by passing the knowledge to the men who came after. This chain of knowledge, from one generation of soldiers to the next, is one of the ways that military organizations preserve hard-won wisdom. The story of how American soldiers stopped digging shallow foxholes and started digging deep ones isn't a tale of brilliant generals or revolutionary new weapons. It's a story of ordinary men facing extraordinary danger, learning through experience, and sharing that knowledge with each other. It's a story of sergeants who cared about their men, of soldiers who paid attention and adapted, of an organization flexible enough to change its doctrine based on what worked in the field. In the end, that's what allowed so many of them to survive. Not luck, though luck certainly played its part. Not just courage, though courage was required in abundance, but also knowledge, technique, and the wisdom to learn from experience. They learned to dig deeper, to construct better positions, to protect themselves more effectively, and in doing so, they gave themselves a better chance to make it home. The frozen ground of the Ardennes, so hard to dig through in that terrible winter of 1944 and 45, now lies quiet. The foxholes have long since been filled in or eroded away. The men who dug them are mostly gone now, their generation passing into history. But the lessons they learned remain, enshrined in doctrine, taught to new soldiers, a legacy of practical wisdom born from the crucible of combat. Every young soldier who learns to dig a proper fighting position is, in a sense, being taught by those World War II veterans. The knowledge flows across the decades, a gift from one generation of warriors to the next. It's a reminder that in war, as in many things, the fundamentals matter. The basics, done well, save lives. And so the story comes full circle. From those first terrible artillery barrages in the Ardennes, through the evolution of techniques and doctrine, to the training fields where today's soldiers learn the same essential lessons. Dig deep, construct properly, pay attention to details. Your life depends on it. Those World War II soldiers, digging through frozen earth by moonlight, exhausted and scared but determined to do everything they could to survive, they left us more than just memories. They left us knowledge, purchased with their blood and fear and determination. And that knowledge continues to save lives, decades after the guns fell silent and the last veteran of that terrible war finally came home for good. This is how progress happens in the military. Not always through dramatic breakthroughs, but sometimes through simple improvements in basic techniques. The soldiers who learned to dig better foxholes didn't change the strategic situation. They didn't win battles single-handedly, but they survived. And survival in the end is the first requirement for everything else. The thunder of artillery, that sound that dominated so much of the war in Europe, eventually faded. The soldiers came home, life continued, but somewhere in training fields and combat zones around the world, soldiers still dig foxholes. And when they dig deep, creating proper protective positions, they're honoring those who learned these lessons the hard way. They're keeping faith with those who didn't make it home, and they're giving themselves the best possible chance to survive whatever comes next. That's the real story behind why soldiers stopped digging shallow foxholes and started digging deep ones. It's a story of learning, adaptation, and the determination to survive. It's a story worth remembering, worth teaching, worth honoring, because the men who learned these lessons paid a heavy price for that knowledge. And the best way to honor their sacrifice is to remember what they learned and to pass it on. The ground protects those who respect it. This simple truth, learned in the frozen forests of Belgium, in the hills of Germany, in countless firefights and artillery barrages, remains as valid today as it was in 1945. Dig deep, construct properly, prepare thoroughly. These aren't just military tactics, they're lessons for life. Be thorough, pay attention to details. Don't cut corners when it matters. The soldiers who survived the war because they dug proper foxholes went on to build families, careers, communities. Their children and grandchildren, growing up in peace, might never fully understand what their father or grandfather went through. But they benefited from those experiences nonetheless, from the values and habits of mind that combat instilled. War is terrible. It destroys lives, ruins families, wastes resources, and inflicts suffering on a scale that peacetime minds struggle to comprehend. But for those caught up in it, survival becomes the paramount concern, and the drive to survive can lead to innovations and insights that, however grimly earned, represent genuine progress. The evolution of foxhole tactics in World War II is one such example. It didn't make war less horrible. It didn't justify the conflict or diminish the tragedy of lives lost. But it did save lives. It did represent human beings learning, adapting, solving problems, and sharing that knowledge with each other. And that capacity for learning and adaptation, even in the worst circumstances, is perhaps something worth celebrating. So when we remember World War II, we remember the great battles and the strategic decisions. We remember the bravery and the sacrifice. But we should also remember the smaller stories, the unglamorous innovations, the practical wisdom earned through hard experience. We should remember the soldiers who learned to dig deep and taught others to do the same. They saved lives with entrenching tools and determination. They turned experience into knowledge and knowledge into survival. That's a legacy worth preserving. That's a story worth telling. And that's why 8 decades after those frozen nights in the Ardennes, we still remember how American soldiers learned to dig better foxholes and, in doing so, gave themselves a better chance to make it home.